Hey, and welcome back to the new season of Shade with me, Lou Mensa. This season, we will be reflecting on the power of the image within the civil rights movement, and my guests include founding members of Black Lives Matter, photographers and editors from publications such as Time magazine and ID, curators and art critics, and together we will be reflecting on the imagery and the stories that came from the Black Lives Matter 2020 uprisings with the people who created them. And I want to say a big thank you to all of my Patreon patrons. I'm honoured to have you all involved in this show and supporting this work and elevating our stories. For as little as £1 a month, you can become a Shade patron and join others in supporting this work and elevating our stories. So go to patreon.com/Shade podcast to become a patron. Okay, so here we go. Episode 7, The Black Lives Matter Raised Fist Salute, in conversation with artist Nicola Green. Support for Shade's Black Images Matter series comes from Curates, creators of organic, superior grade CBD formulations. I talk with the co-founder Kim quite often about our holistic approach not only to health but also to our children's education, an education that nurtures an interest and investment in the world that we all share, and part of Curates' investment is being a long-term partner of the charity Help Refugees. Curates' co-founder, Pedram, has spent many years working with refugees as an interpreter. Kim said of our collaboration that it's crucial to support platforms that engage in important conversations surrounding race, as Shade does so brilliantly. So go to cloriscbd.com to find out more about the range and for information on Help Refugees. And sign up to support Shade through Patreon and you'll receive a Cloris subscriber gift. Throughout history, many communities have raised a fist as a symbol of resistance and unity. The raised fist is believed to have originated with Ishtar, the ancient Assyrian goddess of love, war and fertility, who raised her fist to signify strength in the face of violence. It has since been adopted by different groups during the last century. From the 1917 Russian revolutionaries to the Industrial Workers of the World, or the IWW, the far-left paramilitary organisation affiliated with the Communist Party of Germany during the Weimar Republic. And the first salute was brought back to the States after the Spanish Civil War, where 45,000 anti-fascist volunteers went to fight with the Spanish Republicans in the international brigades, including 2,800 Americans who formed the African-American Lincoln Brigade. The Lincoln Brigade veterans returned to the States and were heavily involved in the civil rights movement. They desegregated swimming pools, ran NAACP chapters and registered voters, and their anti-racism fitted the work of the Black Panther movement. Huey Newton and Bobby Seale raised their fist to exhort members of the Black Panther Party. And now we're moving on to hear my conversation with artist Nicola Green, who used the Black Power salute, the clenched raised fist, of Barack Obama in her work. Nicola Green is renowned for gaining unprecedented access to iconic personalities from the world of politics, religion and culture, including collaborations with Pope Francis and the Dalai Lama. And in 2008, Nicola Green gained unprecedented artistic access to Obama's presidential campaign. She had a front row seat to historic events from Obama's DNC nomination speech to Inauguration. Nicola was behind the scenes, taking photographs, making sketches, and having conversations with press, staff, and citizens. Inspired by her own mixed heritage and multi-faith family, she creates and preserves religious, social, and cultural heritage for future generations. Recording these events as they happen and investing thousands of hours of academic and artistic research, she builds and curates substantial archives. Her series, In 7 Days, is the resulting 7 pieces of work that came from the time that she spent with Obama. In 7 Days is in the permanent collections of the National Portrait Gallery, the Smithsonian Institution in Washington D.C, the Metropolitan Museum of Art, New York, the Library of Congress, Washington D.C, and in both the International Slavery Museum and the Walker Art Gallery in Liverpool. I spoke with Nicola about the process of creating this series, and she shares how her own family influences this work. So, Nicola, this season we are contemplating representation in art through the lens of the imagery that came from the 2020 Black Lives Matter protests. And I was wondering if during this time you noticed a shift in the discussions that you were having, either at the studio or with clients, regarding representation.
Well, yes, absolutely. I think, like most people, the period of lockdown and the Black Lives Matter protests had a huge impact. And I think pretty much all the professional conversations I had with colleagues, other artists, museum curators, and so on, it came up and it was sort of front and center of people's minds. I'm not sure if that's partly because it's, at the core of my issues of identity, race, and difference are at the core of my practice. And I've been sort of making my own work, but also setting up all kinds of different initiatives and so on for years. But yes, I think that also there was a big shift also I found in friends and family, and most particularly in white people that I know who suddenly for the first time ever would raise it with me as a subject, and even very close family members who I think had never felt able or didn't have the language or sort of, felt worried about how they would raise it. Yes, left, right, and centre, everybody has been sort of raising issues of race. But I might add that it, in a sense, for me and for my family and within my studio, it certainly wasn't a new thing because it's pretty much, my daily life in my own practice and in my own family for lots of reasons. It's a sort of constant ongoing discussion and has been ever since I got married and had children. So in terms of sort of my own conversations, as it were, it's not anything new. But in terms of kind of the wider world around it, I think there's been a powerful shift, certainly that I have experienced this summer so far.
Yeah, that's really interesting that because it's the same with me, of course, the conversations within my family just continued as they had been doing before all of the protests happened. But what did change in the conversations that we were having was our response to how other people were responding. Like you say, our white friends. And I think that's definitely affected the way that I sort of look at things within my work moving forward. It really exemplified to me that we are within our own echo chambers, and perhaps the conversations, the understanding about the issues surrounding race aren't as developed in this country as perhaps I thought. And the reactions to the protests really showed me that. And I wondered what you did notice and how other people were coming to you, and if that will affect the way in which, if that will come into your work at some point, or perhaps it's too early to tell. But it's definitely affected my work. It's made me realise how much of an echo chamber that I am in,
I mean, I think that's really interesting. And I've been really thinking about that because differently from you and your experience, I'm a white woman. I grew up without having to think about any of these issues, not at all, barely at all, other than, the odd thing that might come up about race at my primary school or whatever. But I grew up in Stockwell and, at the time of the Brixton riots and so on. But other than that, it's not something I've ever had to think about. So it was only when I got married to a black man, but also somebody in public life. My husband's David Lammy, the Member of Parliament for Tottenham. And, so it's also many of these issues are his work and his life. And there's lots of consequences to that for his family as well as for him personally. But then I've had 3 children, and, from day one, it's been incredibly important to me to think about, what it means to have 3 children who, just by virtue of the color of their skin, have a completely different experience of the world than me. And so I've made it my work. So I think about it also every day, what that means. And I've been on my own journey within my family, as a mother, as a wife, as a friend, but also, within my work, to kind of think about that and understand it and look deeply into it. And actually, you sort of talked about how perhaps undeveloped we are in this country about discussing race. And I must say that, I had this incredible privilege back in 2008 of spending time with Obama on his first campaign to become president. It was an incredibly deep and rich experience for me, not just as a white woman, but also coming from Britain, to experience that campaign in America and to really see kind of, how different it was, in America to in Britain. And I sort of came away from that experience realizing how, in many ways, we see ourselves in Britain as one of the most multicultural places on earth. And we see ourselves as sort of, being able to live alongside each other in a perhaps more functional way than has been possible in America. But actually, I was so struck by how developed conversations on race and identity are in America. Like everybody, even if they have strong opinions, even, people who are perhaps racist, whatever, there's a language, and people discuss it often, frequently in newspapers with each other. And yet I would come back to Britain and it's almost kind of, would feel like a taboo subject. And, there I was, I married a black man, and it was something I barely could discuss with my family. At our wedding, the sermon, it was sort of, started off about that. And I remember vividly a lot of our white friends and family finding that really sort of saying to me, why did he have to go and mention that?
Yes.
Literally they said, why did you? Whereas all David, my husband's black family, thought it was absolutely fantastic that the way they all were like, God, how he talked about that was so wonderful. And all my family and our white friends were like, he didn't need to point that out, And I think that the sort of, idea that somehow we've kind of moved past explicit racism has created a situation for many people in this country where they don't want to discuss it because they feel the minute they discuss it, they're somehow no longer not seeing it. And actually that creates an incredibly stifling environment, I think.
I agree.
My experience of this summer was actually a kind of unleashing, in a sense, in Britain of that kind of taboo, stifled, difficulty for white people, I might add, not black people, in talking about race. That has been definitely a big shift, I think.
Hey, it's Lou here with a quick break to tell you about the remaining 2 episodes of a 4-part collaboration between Shade and Convergence, the South London Gallery's platform for critical conversations, screenings and written commissions. On Saturday, March the 20th, I will be in conversation with Susan Butler. Susan is a writer, performance artist and teacher. Her debut novel, Signet, was published in 2020 and received winner of the Writers Guild First Novel Award. Together, we will be exploring the racial empathy gap in literature. And for our 4th and final episode, on Saturday, April the 17th, I will be in conversation with sound artist and poet Axel Kacoutié. Axel is a multi-award-winning audio artist and poet, so be sure to catch our conversation as bonus content wherever you download Shade Podcast or on the South London Gallery website. Okay, let's get back to today's show. I think that's interesting that you mentioned the elephant in the room, and the opposite of that is the sense of empowerment that people within the Black community and mixed race people feel when they do talk about it, and that we do share our experience and have these open conversations. And what's also very powerful is how we get this sense of empowerment through art and through symbolism and the images that we use to depict our experiences. And one of those very iconic symbols that the Black Lives Matter movement have used, and before then the Black Panthers, one of the symbols was the raised clenched fist that did become iconic as a symbol of resistance. And in 2008, you've just mentioned this, that you gained unprecedented artistic access to Barack Obama's presidential campaign, which culminated in your series of work entitled In 7 Days. And can you just tell us a little bit about how you created that particular piece that depicted this gesture, this symbol, the raised clenched fist, and why you chose it as one of your final pieces?
Well, when I asked him if I could spend time with him on his campaign, there was no sense actually that he was going to win, I might add. I mean, my family and the people I knew thought that, I was quite mad to be investing quite so much time, effort and money in going over to America. For me as a white mother, I was motivated to witness this moment on behalf of my 2 children who had just been born and were too young to kind of experience it and understand it. And I felt, my husband knew Obama, and I felt that I had a kind of possibility of sort of spending time on this campaign and thinking about it as an artist and as a white mother of children that look like Obama, that would be the kind of inheritors, if you like, of the legacy. And at the point that I started, of the legacy of just him even thinking and contemplating running and then, managing a kind of extraordinary campaign. For me, I'd spent time looking at the role models there would be for my boys, as every mother on the planet does when they have their children. And there were so few outside of popular culture that just the idea of him even running was so powerful in my mind for me to be able to talk about with my boys. And so I went off and I spent time on his campaign, and I quickly realized that actually everybody else there were politicians, they were working on the campaign, or they were press, or they were people going to listen, and if they were going to listen, they were just going to one rally in the area that they lived, basically. And that I realized that going to multiple rallies, multiple events, being there next to him on election night, on inauguration, as well as at different rallies around the country, when it was going well, when it was going badly, that actually I had this kind of incredible perspective, but also I wasn't sort of restricted by having to think about producing an image or taking a photo or making something for the next day's news and what it meant in that moment. But I was able just to think about it in terms of the future and the legacy and what it would mean for my children when they were grown up, basically. And so in answer to your question about how I came up with that image, and it took me 2.5 years to come up with that image. In fact, to come up, with, I ended up making 7 images that are part of the In 7 Days series. And that is the second one. I call it Day 2 Struggle. And all 7 took a very long time to get to. And they are part of a kind of complete narrative, which as all 7, they tell the story of what it takes to create something impossible. They tell the story of creation. They tell the story of the cycle of change, the cycle of democracy. So there's a kind of a big meta narrative to all 7 images. But Day 2 Struggle in that meta narrative is kind of the history of what's gone before and what came before to make this moment possible, if you like. And so on one level, that image is about all the people that came before Obama. And as you say, that stretches back through actually everybody that has used that raised fist. And that is not just Black movements, but famously, of course, Mandela used it in that kind of Mandela gesture as he came out of prison. So it was and still is used in an incredibly powerful way in South Africa. And before that, Martin Luther King, as well as that moment in the Olympics. But it's been used by women's movements in a way, really through history. It's been used as a gesture of solidarity, of kind of power, of strength, of struggle, and of kind of symbolizing how to overcome something, if you like. So it has a real long stretch through history that I wanted to kind of refer to and think about, because nobody comes out of nowhere. And, Obama himself talked often about how many people before him had done so much work. So I was really thinking about, it is in fact his hand and his fist, but that image for me was really thinking about the history of that symbol and that kind of long arc of time, if you like, going backwards. And the rest of the series kind of addresses what that symbol will mean in the long arc of time going forward, if you like, and what it will mean to our children, and what will their struggles be, and what will they want to overcome, and how will they overcome it. And they will have to find their own power and their own strength in whatever struggles they face. It's absolutely not limited to kind of one part of society, if you like, but of course, it is most associated with oppression and people who've been oppressed. So if, and in many ways the 20th century was defined by racial struggles across the world. And Obama's election at the beginning of the 21st century was an incredible moment. It's not the end of the story by any means, but it was an incredible culmination of that century of struggle, if you like. So I was thinking about all of that, but I was also thinking about his struggle and how he had got to the place he'd got to. And I read Dreams from My Father, his book, which is really a book that is a deep exploration of his heritage and who he is and where he's come from. And I was so struck by how kind of forensically he'd thought about his mixed heritage and all the difficulties that come with that, as well as the blessings. And I think that this for me is an image about how every single one of us on the planet are only able to kind of find our power and find what we can uniquely give to the world if we kind of go through that struggle of understanding who we are and where we've come from. And that's actually a challenge for all of us, wherever we've come from. And so I think that, it was really striking to me that he'd done so much work on understanding where he'd come from. And so that kind of led me to thinking about my own children and my role as a white mother of kind of, being part of that journey for them. And then there's a kind of another layer of that image where I wanted to think about how we depict people through art in different ways. And skin color is a kind of, is an important part of that. And I'd been really concerned and thinking about how artists kind of depict different people and different skin colors, and what we use to kind of strengthen those narratives and tell those narratives. And of course, one of the most powerful narratives ever made is the Renaissance artists kind of depicting the Holy Family as white. I mean, it's kind of the most incredible whitewashing in art history, really, because they weren't. It's a lie. And yet, that is so powerful now. It's in most people's imagination in all parts of the world. And part of how they did that was by also using the most expensive materials. And if you think of churches and Renaissance paintings and the Sistine Chapel, that they used gold and gold leaf, and that almost kind of heightened the value and legitimized this narrative. Yeah. So I started to use gold, and I did this work on contemporary slavery. And I used the most expensive 24 karat gold that I could get my hands on. Yeah. So this image, Day 2 Struggle, that I've made also uses that 24 karat gold leaf. And for me, it's about value and how we value different people and how we kind of depict skin color. And it's about the value I saw of my own children and how they would value themselves. But also it's kind of thinking about how the people around them and society and the world would see them and value them. So, all the colour in all of these works I thought about, so much. But that gold leaf was sort of really important part of that image for me.
I don't think we can underestimate our own experiences, and you've discussed it here, and how your experiences of being a mother to mixed race children has obviously infiltrated your work, just as my experiences and my own families have affected the work that I do. And I just wonder how your own multi-faith and mixed race family has provided inspiration for perhaps any other series that you've worked on, because I have been spending quite a bit of time engaging with your Encounters series particularly, and I just wonder, what's resonated most for you throughout this series or any other work that you've done, and when you've been thinking about the ideas of difference?
Well, I feel really lucky. I feel incredibly lucky to have a job that I get to make this. I get to make the things that I'm interested in, my work and my job. Yeah. Since I've had children, all of my work has been 100% on this topic. And I can say that my family and my children in particular have inspired all of it and have led me to this journey. The work I did, The Dance of Colour, was sort of a work thinking about how carnival is a sort of culmination of it really of indigenous African and European cultures. And I sought, and people are kind of really familiar with, the music that kind of came out of that. But actually, I was really interested in the kind of visual imagery of that, of how that came to pass and how that's sort of developed. And obviously, in a way, that was an exploration of my own family and, was an incredible journey for me. But Encounters has been 10 years in the making, and is a reflection of my own family history as well as my husband's, and kind of thinking about, the difficulties, I suppose, in any mixed heritage, mixed religion, family. Difference is one of the most kind of incredible, fulfilling, amazing journeys that you can go on when you are able to kind of accommodate and learn from other people and live alongside it. But it's also, as I'm sure also raises lots of challenges and can be very difficult. And so in that kind of difficulty comes out some of the most beautiful parts of being human, if you like. But I guess I landed on encounters partly because religious difference in many ways is the most absolute difference as human beings that we have. There's no room, in a way, for any kind of grey areas with faith, because especially kind of missionary faiths, you believe in, you have your belief, and it by definition excludes all others. So I was really interested in the last decade, really since 9/11, where religious leaders from around the world started to kind of challenge that themselves and with each other, and began to start working out how they could kind of articulate their respect for each other and each other's faith without in any way undermining the absolute nature of their own faith. I persuaded the religious leaders to let me sit in on those private meetings over the course of 10 years. And this work is really a kind of culmination of that journey that they were on, that I have sort of documented and charted in this work, and then kind of spent years thinking about in all kinds of different ways, and I could go on about that for hours. But what I would say, and why I think it relates quite beautifully to what you're talking about in the Raised Fist and the work of In 7 Days, is that actually the kind of interfaith movement really began in the civil rights era with Martin Luther King getting different religious leaders to walk with him on the civil rights journey. I think that, it's quite powerful in people's minds that when Rabbi Heschel marched, side by side with Martin Luther King on the march from Selma to Montgomery.
From all over the country, I suspect that we will have representatives from almost every state in the Union, and naturally a large number of people from the state of Alabama. And we hope to see, and we plan to see, the greatest witness for freedom that has ever taken place on the steps of the capital of any state in the South.
And that was a kind of defining image of the civil rights movement, and a kind of a shift, if you like. And similarly, Desmond Tutu and Mandela got different religious leaders in South Africa to also kind of walk with them on the journey, the anti-apartheid movement. And that too kind of really made a big difference to how that struggle was kind of understood, not just in South Africa, but around the world. So I think that, how as human beings we have moved towards kind of understanding each other's difference is it's incredibly complex, but it's an incredibly important part of what it means to be human. And so, both series of work for me are really an exploration of that.
And you talk about this long journey that we are on, and we are all on this together collectively. And what light do you see within the work that the art community are collectively doing, in particular, that gives you hope that we are progressing? So the work that people are creating, the discussions that we are having, the messages that the institutions are giving, and what light do you see that is giving you hope that things are moving forward, Nicola?
Well, in 2015, curator David A. Bailey and myself set up the Diaspora Pavilion, and that had been a long kind of conversation in the making before it actually turned into reality, and kind of culminated in the Diaspora Pavilion in the 2017 Venice Biennale. Yeah. And at the time, that was, the first of its kind ever, not just in this country, but in the world, in the art world. It was, it was really a big deal. And it began all kinds of discussions within the art world. But I think that what I would think is that this year, those discussions which felt like a struggle, like a long road to kind of inching forward, it's not like anything is remotely solved, because it takes years and years and years. But I think that the kind of desire and the sort of understanding that the art world in this country needs to change, the idea that artists, the art world, it should be sort of the vanguard, if you like, of progress and change. And actually, it hasn't been in this country. It really hasn't. It's been almost exclusively white. Yeah. I think that there's a kind of understanding that that's not right. Actually, what happens to, in practice, change that is much more kind of difficult and takes a longer time. But I think at least it is a shift that, accepting in a wider sense that it's a problem, I think, is obviously the first thing that has to happen before any real change can kind of happen. And so I think I'm hopeful that that things will change, and I certainly see lots of people willing and wanting to make change. It takes generations really to make a difference, especially when the issues are systemic. Because it starts at childhood. And I think that to become an artist, to in any form, to go into the arts is difficult and a hard route for anybody. If you are disadvantaged, if in any shape or form, it's going to be 1,000 times harder. So so the shifts all have to start happening from childhood, and that's challenging. You can't just sort of, you can make a few differences in the art world for and with adults, but actually the real job of work is to shift expectations, opportunities, and so on for children.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much.
Hey, it's Lou here, and as we round up this episode, I want to share my thoughts on my conversation with Nicola. Gaining artistic access to Barack Obama's campaign trail is clearly a result of being a brilliant and successful artist, as well as having familial ties with Obama. This is how access works. Was her access because she was white? No. However, in many instances, we know that it is, and we've talked about institutional gatekeepers at length, so we don't need to elaborate on that. But the problem with the messaging that we do give artists is that success, in whatever terms you view that, comes quickly, and that's misguided. The relationships we build take time alongside our practice, and what's important is where privilege is taken beyond one's own work and career elevation, and we need to see more of that. I reached out to Nicola not only because of her own practice, but because of her focus on supporting emerging artists. We didn't touch on that in the chat, so I wanted to just mention it here. But she mentored the brilliant artist Kadia Say, who at the age of 24 was the youngest artist to show at the Diaspora Pavilion at the Venice Biennale. The pavilion was co-founded by Nicola to support artists of colour who have not had access to these institutional markers of success. But Kadia's life was taken from her in the Grenfell Tower fire, and we know why that happened. And despite the opportunities that Kadia had, ultimately that did not and could not save her. She was from an immigrant family living in a council tower block. And all of the lives that were taken on the 14th of June 2017 were taken by those who were very conscious of their gross negligence, but continued to ignore the needs of the residents. Following the tragedy in 2019, Nicola set up the Kadia Say Arts Programme at Into University, where Kadia had received her own learning. And the programme works with organisations, artists, schools and young people, encouraging them in their creative studies and careers. And this is what we need to see. Real long-term support for talented artists, the kind of support that institutions ring-fence us out of. This is the opposite of paying lip service, of posting social media statements, of institutions creating their optical allyship with their one-off initiatives. Until those with privilege and power step up and share their spaces, which is ultimately a misnomer in itself, right, because we know how these galleries were built, but there's little space for us to accept what little has been on offer from them to this point. So don't just accept what is given, take up space, live your truth through the power of the work that you create. Because it's been a long time coming. Okay, that's it for this episode, and I'll see you next time. If you enjoyed this show, please support the work by subscribing via whatever app you listen to your podcasts on, and consider becoming a Shade patron by visiting patreon.com/Shade Podcast. Shade is produced and hosted by me, Lou Mensa, and the music is created for Shade by legendary composer Brian Jackson, half of the power duo Gil Scott-Heron and Brian Jackson. Thanks to Content is Queen for assistant editing and to C.A. Davis for editing, mixing and sound design. Be sure to listen to C.A.'s own brilliant show called A Lato Thought. I'll let C.A. tell you a little bit about that now. Thanks for listening. See you next time.
My name is C.A. Davis. And this is A Lato Thought, an immersive podcast that dismantles post-racial myths about mixed-race identities. Analyzing American history, law, and empire, each episode examines a contemporary idea about mixed-raceness in order to reveal that
race is the lie that became real.
You see, in America, mixed-race people have been routinely exploited to both justify and challenge systems of white supremacy.
The hypo-descent rule became the formalized definition of hereditary slavery.
But people are not mixed. History is mixed.
In the early 20th century, in Harlem, New Orleans, Black and South Asian peoples made lives together.
The Creek Nation and the Cherokee Nation joined at Greenwood and Asher, right where the Tulsa riots occurred.
And it's those historical processes of empire, war, immigration, economics that mix us all up.
The idea that mixed-race people are somehow more biologically, genetically fit. I mean, that's just not true.
Some multiracial people say, yes, they are Black, but it doesn't encompass the fullness of, say, being raised by a Korean mom.
So tune in as academic research and histories are brought to rich sonic life and woven together with the voices of intellectuals leading their fields. Follow the show on Instagram and Twitter, both at LATTO_THOUGHT, and subscribe on your favorite podcast app today. My name is C.A. Davis, and I'll talk to you all soon.